That'll wake you up. Well, as Jack was saying, we're in this series, and we're looking at what Jesus is saying to these different churches in Revelation. And this morning, we're going to talk about growth. We're going to talk about growing, and that's so important. And the series itself is about this challenge to live a deeper, larger life in God. That's something that he has for us. That's something that he desires for us. And in each of these churches, he presents that. He lays that out. And it's a call for us as a church to live that deeper, larger life in God. But it's also a call for us as individuals to live a deeper and larger life. So if you want, flip over to the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 2. That's where we're going to pick up in a moment. And part of what we're doing is understanding that with each of these letters, they're to specific cities, and there's uniquenesses to these cities that kind of play into some of the stuff that Jesus is saying to them. Pergamum, in some ways, is very similar to Ephesus that we looked at last week, kind of a cosmopolitan city, although Pergamum had so many different cults, so many different gods and temples that they worshiped, even more so than Ephesus. In fact, the very way the city was designed, it was designed around this grouping of all of these temples, including this massive, massive throne we'll talk about here in a moment. But when you think of Pergamum, you've got to think of, well, what casinos are to Vegas, temples are to Pergamum, okay? It's just every place you turn, there's like another temple to this god, that god, whatever. They had this giant throne, which was very uncommon for cities in this day and time. They didn't have like large thrones or altars, like we think about the altar in the temple for the Jews. Typically, it was all built around temples or shrines. But they had apparently this massive, massive throne. It was made for the worship of Zeus and Athena. And because Zeus was considered like one of the more powerful gods, this giant god, they felt he needed this kind of throne that he would sit on. And what's interesting is that over time, by the time you get to the first century AD, when the church gets established here, this massive throne apparently was also used by enfolding the worship of Caesar. The worship of Caesar was very important to the church here in Pergamum. In fact, there were contests that would go on with some of these outlying cities throughout the Roman Empire to see which cities would do the best job of worshiping Caesar. And Pergamum did very well at this. They won some contests with this. Some of the things that they did, they put up all of these white stones. Archaeologists have found these large white slabs of stone, and on them were these inscriptions about different Caesars, honoring the different Caesars. And out of doing such a good job of this, and of course cities wanted this, because if you won I don't know what all the prizes were for being the number one Caesar worship city, Caesar might come and visit you. And when Caesar would come and visit you, he would bring lots of Caesar goodies, right? And so cities would love this. It's a little bit like having the Olympics come to your town, right? Think of the economic impact that would have. And Pergamum did an outstanding job of this. In fact, they were given what was called the right of the sword. And some scholars call that different things, but it was this idea, the right of the sword, in which a city, Pergamum was one of the few cities that was given this, the right to execute in the authority of Rome, which was a big deal. So they didn't have to go through some of the same rigmarole that other cities would go through. They had the right to execute people that with the authority of Rome, which is a big deal. So now, when you think about this devout worship that they had to Caesar and this economic thrust behind it, how do you think they thought about people who weren't real big on the idea of worshiping Caesar? Maybe people who thought there was only one God. Maybe people who said, I can honor Caesar, but I'm not going to worship him like a God because I don't believe he's a God, right? In other words, for Christians, this was a hard place to live. There would have been tremendous amounts of pressure for Christians to cave on this. And so look at what he says. Flip over to Revelation chapter 2. I'm going to get a quick drink here. he says this. Look at verse 12. Verse 12, he says, to the angel of the church in Pergamum write, these are the words of him who has the sharp double-edged sword. Okay, now think about the imagery here, right? He might be saying, Pergamum might have a sword. They might have some of that Roman authority, but Jesus is saying, I've got a bigger sword, okay? I'm more powerful. Don't worry about the power of Rome, okay? Don't worry about the power of Pergamum. He says, and now this next statement, he says right here in verse 13, this is a very empathetic statement when he says this. I want you to think about it. Look at this. He says, I know where you live. It's like Jesus is saying, I get it. I understand you live in the Mecca of everything that isn't Christian. I understand you live in a city where it is not easy to be one of my followers, because there is incredible pressure and a willingness to persecute you for your beliefs that is daunting. But he goes on and he says this, I know where you live, where Satan has his throne. That's interesting, because this is one of the only cities that had one of these giant thrones. Now, understand this too. There wouldn't have been Satan worship in the first century the way we think of Satan worship. You get your satanic Bible and there's like worship of the actual person Satan when they would think of that. Instead, this is probably speaking to something much deeper. What Jesus is saying here is, I get that there are spiritual forces, satanic forces that are behind all of this stuff that's working against you in all of this. So he's talking about something deeper here than just there was some cult into Satan worship. He says this, where Satan has his throne, yet you remain true to my name. You did not renounce your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was put to death in your city where Satan lives. And so Jesus says some really encouraging things to them here. He says, you know what? I get it, man, I get it. You have stood up. You have not compromised. You have not given in the face of a difficult time. And hats off to you. Real encouraging words here. But I want you to think about this, though. Everything that these chapters 2 and 3 is about is about challenging. And we want this series to be this idea of challenging us. And this morning, my challenge for you is a challenge to grow. And Jesus is going to go on and he's going to say some things to the church in Pergamum, and he's going to challenge them. He's going to challenge them to grow. And what's interesting is he's going to challenge them to grow on some of the very things that he said, man, hats off, you did a great job of this. And I want you to think about this. No matter where you are in your spiritual journey, maybe you're here this morning and you're new at this whole spiritual journey business. In fact, maybe you just say, I'm just kind of at that place where I'm pretty sure God exists. I've never had a moment where I say, okay, I am now a follower of Jesus. I haven't done that whole thing. I'm here kind of seeking, figuring out, walking through this thing. Maybe that's you. Maybe you're here this morning and you're saying, I've been there, done that. I've walked this thing for years and years and years. I've been on the mountaintops. I've been in the valleys. I've been in the dry days, the good days. I've been in the challenging days. I've been in the easy, I've been through all of this. But here's the deal. No matter where you are on that continuum, you can grow. No matter where you are on that continuum, God is summoning you to grow. Because in the universe we live in, this amazing universe, this amazing realm that we live in that God has created, okay, there's always room to grow. There's always room to live and engage in a larger life. That is the nature of the God we worship. He is unending. He is unfathomable. There's always room to grow. And part of being a follower of Christ is growing. It is continuing to step more and more into that larger, deeper life with him. So this morning, I want to challenge us to live more into that deeper life. Now, that means we've got to grow. And to grow, you understand, growth is not something we just have total control over ourselves. Rather, it comes as a kind of gift, but it doesn't come as a typical gift. Some gifts we get, and all we have to do with the gift is just receive it. Someone gives you something. In fact, I've got an example. I want to illustrate that. How many of you like French press? Any French press drinkers in here? You like French press? Okay. I'm going to give you some French press. I made some just a little while ago as the service was starting. Here, I'm going to pour it. Come right up here and get it. There you go. And I tell you what, I'm going to pour another cup. You find someone else to give some French press to. This is good stuff, I'm telling you. There you go, there you go. There you go. Anyway, I bet I've got enough for another cup. Anyone want another cup? Anyone want a cup of French press? Come right here. Come here, Juan. There you go, man. There you go, man. Now here's the illustration. There's your French press. Now, what did he have to do to get that? You want a lid? You can have a lid. I don't have any fancy creamer though. But real French press drinkers just drink it black. I'm just saying, yeah. Now, some gifts are just like that, right? They're just offered, and all you have to do is just receive it. Just come up and just receive it. There are so many places in Scripture that talk about gifts like that. Let me give you some examples. The grace of God is that kind of gift. You just receive it. Life with God, to have a relationship with God, salvation with God comes is a gift that you just receive it. You just say, in fact, what does John say in the first chapter of John, verse 12? He says, to all who just receive and believe are made children of God. God's love comes is that kind of gift, okay? Some gifts come like that from God. Now, growth, and here's the bad news. Growth is not one of those kinds of gifts, okay? You don't just one morning say, you know, I want to grow spiritually. God, would you grow me spiritually? And he goes, sure. Poof, you're a spiritual giant, okay? You don't just wake up one morning, pray to be a spiritual mother or father, and you know, bang, you're there, all right? Doesn't work that way, does it? In fact, spiritual growth is a kind of process. And the oddity of spiritual growth, you got to get this. The oddity of spiritual growth is we're not passive in it, yet we don't have direct control over it. It's not like I get to just say, I'm going to grow today. I'm going to grow spiritually today, so I'm just going to grow myself spiritually. Can't do it any more than I could say to the muscles in my arm, I want to be as buff as Arnold Schwarzenegger. So muscles grow muscles, grow. I can't do that, can I? I don't have direct control over the growth of my muscles. I can go into the gym and yell at them, scream at them, whisper them, kiss them, do whatever, but they're not going to grow, are they? What do I have to do? Work them. Yeah. Darn, don't you hate that? Yeah. Here's the deal. I can open myself up to my muscles growing, strengthening, getting larger. I can work out. I can eat right. I can get enough sleep. I can open myself up to that process. And in a similar way, spiritual growth, I don't have direct control over it. But you know what? I can open myself up to it. There are things that God does in my life, moments where he summons me to view things deeper, to face things in my life. And in those moments, I can yield to God, I can open my heart, or I can push back. See, spiritual growth is one of those difficult gifts that where you're not passive, but you don't have direct action over it, but you need to be active in it. But it is an amazing thing as we learn how to engage in that process that we grow, okay? And what Jesus is gonna get at here with this group is this challenge to grow. Now, here's why I say this, and here's why I give this challenge, okay? Is that too often, believers sit back and just wait very passively to just kind of grow spiritually. We just kind of go to church and we pray a little and we read the Bible a little and we do a few things. We do some activities that just seem like the right things to do. But the deeper moments where God summons us to a new place, when God summons you, calls you to that larger life, we don't always respond in those moments. We don't always know how to respond in those moments, okay? It's a difficult thing to do. And so this morning, I want to talk about what it is to to take advantage of those moments, to live in those moments, to live that larger life. But to live that larger life means a life of growth. And we're going to see what else that means. So flip with me, or you're already in Revelation, aren't you? Look at Revelation chapter 2. Look at verse 14. He says this, nevertheless, I have a few things against you. So here comes the challenge. You know, all this great stuff you did, but here's what I hold against you. Here, and take this when he says, I hold this against you. This is his challenge. He's saying, this is the place you can grow. Here's what I have for you, okay? He says, nevertheless, I have a few things against you. You have people there who hold to the teachings of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin by eating food sacrificed to idols, by committing sexual immorality. Now, great lesson here, and it goes back to this old story we're going to look at in a moment here about Balaam and Balak. But let me say this. There is a first cut surface level lesson here that I don't want to pass over, and we're just going to look at it for a second. And it is this. It's really simple. Don't go around tempting, teaching, or leading, or corrupting people into doing things God does not want them to do, okay? Let's just all agree leading other people to sin is not good, and we shouldn't do it, okay? That's just like Christianity 101, okay? It hurts other people, it hurts us, God doesn't like it, and we should just not do it, okay? That's kind of the surface lesson right here. And of course, this goes back to this story of a priest by the name of Balaam, who leads a bunch of Israelites into sin and teaches Balak how to do this. And it's a horrible thing that he does. Shouldn't do it. But understand that there is a spiritual lesson here about growth and challenging us in deep ways that goes much deeper than just this thing about let's not be people that tempt other people to sin. And we'd all have stories about when someone else tempted us. We'd all have stories when we tempted someone else. And I'm just going to leave it with, we all know better. So let's stop doing that, but let's learn this deeper lesson here. So let me give you some background on this. And if you want, you can turn over to the book of Numbers, chapter 22. We're going to be there in just a moment and look at this story. But let me give you some background to this. This story probably takes place somewhere around 1300 BC, long time ago. The Israelites have fled Egypt, and now they're making their way to the promised land. Remember, they go through the whole 40 years out in the wilderness, and now they're getting ready to move in, and they're all excited. But here's the problem. When the Israelites are moving into the promised land that God gave them, it's not like there's a highway from Egypt straight into the promised land. In order for them to get there, they've got to go through some neighborhoods that don't belong to them, okay? They've got to go through some backyards of some other people. Now, that may not seem like a big deal, except there were a lot of them, okay? Scholars' best guesses are there were somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million Jews at this point. Imagine 2 or 2.5 million people just sauntering through your neighborhood. It would make you a little nervous, don't you think? Might bother you a little bit in there. And so everywhere they went, no matter whose neighborhood they went through, they made people nervous all of the time. So as we pick up the story here, they are now on the outskirts of a nation by the name of Moab. And the king of Moab at this time was Balak. And Balak sees 2.5 million people, coming down I-10 right for his neighborhood. And he's a little nervous. But here's this quandary. He's like, I don't really want to get in a fight with them. There's like 2.5 million of them. I don't know how that's going to play out. I'm not real excited about tangling with them. But in the same moment, I don't want to invite them in. I don't want to say, oh, come on in. We'll throw something on the grill. He's like, I want them to go away. But they're not going away, okay? And so he comes up with this plan. Rather than facing this thing head on, Balak comes up with this kind of devious plan. And his devious plan is there's this priest that seems to have a lot of power, a lot of influence, and his name is Balaam. He was this pagan priest somewhere in that area, and he hires Balaam to come, and he says, Balaam, here's what I need you to do. See all these people coming? I don't want to deal with them. Will you curse them and make them just crumble? Give them some awful curse where they get some disease and all die, or they go crazy and run around or jump in the ocean or something. I don't know, just make them go away. Okay, and Balaam's like, great, I'll make, he's gonna make a lot of money on this deal. But here's what happens in the story. This is where things with God always get so interesting. Here's this pagan priest, Balaam. God speaks to this priest. And all of a sudden, his life is like, imagine this, right? He's like, not freaked out, but this changes everything. All of a sudden, he realizes the God of the Israelites is a different kind of God. This God is like a real God. This God is like the God of everything. And Balaam decides, maybe I don't want to curse his people. That could end poorly for me. But here's his quandary. But I've got the king of Moab who's putting the thumb screws to me to curse him. And there's this back and forth emotion where Balaam keeps going over and God keeps saying, Balaam, I don't want you to curse them. Don't do that. Things like, okay. So he goes over to Balak. Hey, so what if? And Balak's like, come on, get with the program. Go curse them. And this becomes really this very sobering moment for Moab and for Balaam. Look what the text says. Look at chapter 22, starting in verse 2. Look what it says. It says, now Balak, son of Zippor, and his grandfather evidently invented the zipper on there, but just kidding. I know. Bad joke. Okay. Saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites, and Moab was terrified because there were so many people. Indeed, Moab was filled with dread because of the Israelites. Well, no kidding. You got 2.5 people coming down the turnpike your way. The Moabites said to the elders of Midian, this horde is going to lick up everything around us as an ox licks up the grass of the field. They're just like, there's going to be nothing left. They're going to eat everything we have. They're just gonna tear the whole place up. It reminds me a little bit, how many of you have ever been a counselor like on a high school camp trip? Okay. Do you remember loading up the buses and driving to camp? And you get a third of the way, halfway to camp, and you got 150 high schoolers all in buses. And it's time to take a potty break. And all those buses pull into one little Circle K somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. And I've been on these trips. I was the high schooler on these trips. And the clerk in the Circle K is like, I'm going to hit my sale quota for the month in the next 10 minutes. But the bathroom's never going to be the same. We're going to run 150 high schoolers through one bathroom in 20 minutes. Yeah, that bathroom, don't go in there for a week or two, right? Yeah, and it's just you can see the clerk in there just going, I don't know if I'm going to survive this. This could get really ugly. And you run, 150 high schoolers go into one Circle K, and above the door it says, occupancy 34 people or something, and you put 150 in there. Well, that's Moab. They're just going, I don't know if we can handle this. This could be bad, okay? So there's this moment where Balaam is asked to curse the Israelites, and God speaks to him, summons him to something deeper. I don't want you to do this. See, this becomes this massive leadership challenge. This is his moment to all of a sudden say, you know what? I'm going to give some leadership to Balak and the Moabites. This is my moment to lead them. This is my moment to understand God is doing something amazing. This is the moment where God is taking the Israelites into the promised land. And what happens when they go into the promised land? They become a nation. They become God's nation, God's community. And from this nation will come the Messiah, the Redeemer of the entire world. See, in this incredible moment, Balaam has this opportunity to be a part of God's universal redemptive plan for humanity. But he's got some stuff going on here. He's got some things that are driving him crazy. And what happens is what I'm going to call, it's his shadow side begins to come out here. And I want to talk about the shadow side because we all have a shadow side here. Our shadow side is that part of us in our sin nature that is mostly unconscious to us. We're not aware of all the things that are going on, but it's that part of us that has hidden fears, hidden drivers, hidden motives, and they're always at play, always pushing us to do different things, and they live out of our fears and out of our insecurities, and we may not be aware of them, but that doesn't mean that they're not operating in our lives. And you've just got to picture, what's his face? What's the guy's name? Balaam, excuse me. Third service here. Balaam, you've got to picture Balaam in this moment. He's got a shadow side where there's a part of him that says, I'm this famous, well-known priest around here. I'm here. I want the Moabites to be impressed with me. I sure don't want the king of the Moabites to be mad at me. That could end in my death. That could end with parts of me being cut off. Okay, I could lose limbs over this deal. But in the same token, I've got this God that is different than any other God. In fact, there's one verse that hints at this idea that Balaam is going to give up sorcery. He's going to kind of give up some of this other stuff because he realizes this is the real God. And this is his moment to step up and say, I'm going to face these fears with Moab and Balak. But he's got some deep drivers going on. He is afraid, what happens if Balak gets mad at me? See, what Balaam is really wanting is he's wanting a very small world, a small world where things are safe and certain. He wants to know exactly what happens. He doesn't want to have to make any decisions that aren't safe, and to go against Balak is a very unsafe decision. But isn't that you and me? Isn't there a part of us, our shadow self, that really truly desires a world that's kind of small, where everything's safe and everything's secure, where everything's certain. I want to be certain about my relationship with God. I want to be, God, you want me to go do this, but I want to be certain about it. God, I want to know that you're going to work it out the way that I see fit. I want you to work things out in my family. I want you to work things out with the cancer. I want you to work things out with my job. I want that small world where things are safe and certain. But friends, here's the deal. The world that God created isn't that small. And the universe that he has invited us to live in and have life and breath and meaning is rarely certain and rarely safe. And if you want to grow, you must be willing to step out into a world that isn't always certain and isn't always safe. But our shadow side always wants us to cave into those things. And here's the deal. When we give into our shadow, when we attempt to say, I don't want to hear about this bigger world out here. All I want to think about is a world where things are safe and certain. That is a perfect recipe for compromise. When we try to live in that world, when we follow our shadow, we will always cave to compromise. And that's what happens to Balaam. In the end, Balaam can't get Balak to give into this thing, and he's not going to go against God here. So here's what he does. Instead of cursing the Israelites, instead of saying, Balak, let me give you some leadership about doing what you do not want to do, instead, you know what he does? He goes over to Balak and says, I'm not going to curse him because Yahweh could, get upset about that. But let me let you in on a little secret. What I've learned about this God, what you need to do is get a bunch of your temple prostitutes and go over to the Israeli camp and throw like a welcome to Moab party, okay? Get the girls over there, get everyone all liquored up and get them to begin having sex with your temple prostitutes as an act of worship to pagan gods. That'll do it. That'll get them in big trouble really fast. And it's a total compromise. And I promise you, it is not what Balaam ultimately wanted. He stayed in that small world and he lives in this compromise and he never gets to experience the life that God really wanted him to live. He could have been a part of establishing God's community on this earth, but it doesn't happen. And you and I will face the same things. We have those shadows, those fears that are in operation deep in our psyche. It's the man who grew up with the message again and again, even as a young boy, that the only way that he had value was in the things that he accomplished. And so he grew up and it was like, I got to get the grades that show that I'm valuable. I've got to compete and win in sports in a way that gives me value. I've got to be the guy that's popular at school in order to have value. When he gets his first job, he's got to achieve and achieve and achieve. And nothing wrong with achieving, nothing wrong with excelling in sports, except for his shadow side is saying, you're not okay. You're not worthy. You are empty if you don't achieve in this world. And so his shadow self is this empty shell of a man, desperate for the next achievement. And so what happens? Without realizing it, without wanting to do it, he will compromise. He will lie. He will cheat. He will cut corners to get that next sale, to be successful in business, because it's not just about lying or cheating. To him, his very identity is at stake. See, that's how awful our shadow selves are. And we're so unaware so often when they're in operation in our hearts, because so much of this happens at a subconscious level. It's the woman who grew up, and whether her parents meant it or not, or her friends meant it or not, she heard the message again and again and again. You're kind of helpless. You always need somebody there to take care of you. You always need someone to help you out. You need a rescuer. And somewhere in all of that, maybe well-meaning people that were trying to take care of her and help her out or do whatever, she grows up and she never feels secure on her own. She feels like the only way she'll be safe in this life is if there's always someone around her willing to rescue her if something goes wrong. Always someone there to nurture her or to care for her. And here's where she's going to cave. Her relationships will then all be about, what does that person offer me to keep me secure? And never intending to, she will manipulate, she will guilt, she'll do whatever she has to do to make sure she keeps people around her that make her feel safe. Not because she wants to be manipulative or create undue guilt in people, but because her identity feels like it is at stake. And you know what God says to us? Because see, we all have those. We all have different ones. God summons us to a larger life by which we say, I'll face those fears. I'll come to see that I am more than my accomplishments. I'll come to see that in God, I am quite secure, even when life goes bad, that I am okay, even when I don't have people around me that can rescue me. I'll be okay in this world, even if things go bad, even in an uncertain, dangerous, large world. I must grow to live for the meaning and the purpose that God has given me. See, that's where growth asks us to go. Now, let me say this as well. You know, sometimes, and I'm kind of off my notes here on this deal, but let me say this. Sometimes we look at the sins in our life and we see some sin and it just kills us. We just go, God, I didn't want to do that and I don't know why I did that. And then we go back and we try and stop it again and we sin in that same area all over again. We get in these patterns. And sometimes we think, man, if I can just get this sin under control, if I can just get that area of my life, I get that under control, that will cause me to grow. I want to get my sin under control because then somehow magically God makes me grow, okay? Now, there are many times that we need to focus and seek to push back temptations, understand how to get sins under control and focus on them because it does have an effect on our spiritual growth. But what if there is an inverse relationship at work as well? What if sometimes we are hard at work trying to get sins under control when all this stuff is going on down below that we're not even aware of, thinking it will make us grow spiritually? What if the inverse is true? What if we give ourselves over to growing with God, and through growing as human beings, as growing spiritually, those sins begin to go away because we have grown? What if there's truth to that as well? See, I think what Jesus is doing here in this moment with this church in Pergamum is they're saying, you've done well, but I want to challenge you to grow more. See, here's what it means. It means facing our fears. Those moments that there's some fear, some insecurity that we have, oftentimes those are our greatest moments of potential growth spiritually. Those are the moments that we can pause and say, okay, God, why am I afraid? Why am I afraid? Where am I insecure? God, what am I not stepping into? What have you summoned me to do that I'm not doing because I want a small world? And friends, I want to challenge you. In those moments that God summons you to face your worst fears, like what Balaam has to face here, moments at work, maybe it's with your spouse. You know, you get in this big fight with your spouse. You know what happens to me when I get in a fight with Angie? I think, man, Angie needs to be a better wife. She's got this problem and that problem and this problem. Boy, if she would work on those issues, what a better human being she would be. Now, here's what I've learned. And seriously, I can go to that place, okay? But here's the deal. Sometimes, okay, let's be honest. Most of the time, that's about me. That if I'm the one that's frustrated, and you know what? Sometimes, I don't know if you're like this. None of you are probably like this. None of you are probably like this. But we can put expectations on our spouse out of our own fears and insecurities. If my spouse would just do this, then my life will be happy. If my spouse would just be this way, then that would reflect well on me. If my spouse would just do this, it would take care of my need. If my spouse would, and what if in those moments that you feel the most frustration with your spouse, you would just say, you know what? God, are you telling me something about me? And maybe this is a moment I need to just not even worry an ounce about my spouse. And I need to say, maybe this is your summons for me to grow. Maybe there's something I'm not seeing very much. God, help me to see. Why am I frustrated? What am I afraid of? What am I insecure with? What am I looking for? And maybe you want me to step out in faith with you, God, and quit trying to get my spouse to make my world nice, small, secure, and safe. And I need to venture out into a dangerous, unsure world where I can grow. See, and I want to challenge you to do that, friends. Find those places where there are fears or insecurities and see those as gifts. Not nice gifts, but good gifts. Gifts where you can grow. Now, let me end this one thing. I'm out of time, but I want you to look at one of these blessings that Christ gives the church at Pergamum. Look down at verse 17. He says this. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And there's so much good stuff in here. I should have made this into 2 sermons, okay? But it says, to him who overcomes, right? And that's about growth. To him overcoming, we're going to grow if you overcome. To him who overcomes, I will give you, and he gives them 3 things, hidden manna, and that's about God sustaining you. In those moments where you face your fears, in those moments you face your insecurities, in those moments where you answer the summons of God to live a deeper, larger life, he's saying, I'll sustain you. Behind the scene, I can sustain you. And then he goes on, he says, and I will give you a white stone, and you think about Pergamum, all that, but I love this. And he says, a white stone with a new name. Okay, and there's a lot of biblical significance behind that. Think of all the times in Scripture where God gives somebody a new name. Think of Jacob. There's Jacob, right? And which means deceiver or supplanter. And here's Jacob, and his life is a wreck. He's the deceiver. And God says, you know what? I know you're all messed up, but I want to challenge you to grow. I want you to grow. You're going to become something else. And what does he rename him? Israel. You're going to become the father of a nation. Think of a kind of a wild, ADD, unstable character by the name of Simon. Simon's kind of wild, kind of compulsive in everything he does. And you might look at him and go, oh, this guy, he's not a leader. He can't get anything done. We never know what he's going to do next. And Jesus looks at Simon and says, Simon, I'm going to name you Peter, because you're going to become a rock. He says to a guy named Saul, you got it so wrong. You're persecuting the church. You're arresting Christians. You're having them hauled off to be killed. And Jesus says, Saul, I'm going to name you Paul. And you are going to become the man who will lead the gospel message into all the Gentile nations. See, friends, what Jesus is saying in Revelation 2 is, you have a new name. That is your summons. That is what you're being called to. And to live out that new name, though, you will have to face your fears. But in it, you will become all you were created to be. Great story. Y'all remember the baseball coach, Tommy Lasorda? Remember that guy, Tommy Lasorda? Great coach. Years and years ago, he had a pitcher by the name of Orel Hershiser. Remember Orel Hershiser? And he was kind of this slumped over, just kind of quiet pitcher, and he didn't seem like much. Nobody thought much of him, but he kind of got into the majors. Tommy Lasorda saw Orel Hershiser and said, this guy's got the stuff. This guy could become a great pitcher in the major leagues. The problem is, every time he goes out to the field, everyone's going, go Hershiser, go Hershiser. You say Hershiser 10 times in a row, and you're just all tongue-tied, and doesn't invoke a lot of fear in your competitors, right? So Tommy Lasorda gave Orel Hershiser his new name. Anyone know what the new name was he gave him? Bulldog. That's right. No more. Take the mound, Orel. It's you're a bulldog. You go out there, bulldog. And he named him Bulldog. And the next thing you know, Orel Hershiser started living up to the name Tommy Lasorda gave him. He became this amazing pitcher. And one time in a pennant race, on their way to the World Series, they were playing the Mets. And you knew the Mets were going down in this game because the pitcher they put on the mound was a guy by the name of Ron Darling. Yeah. So every time Ron would take the field, everyone's going, strike him out, Darling. You go, Darling. And then, Tommy Lasorda would send Orel out there. You go, Bulldog. Get him, Bulldog. And it's just this thing where Tommy Lasorda was calling him out, summoning him to live bigger and deeper in who he really was. And friends, Jesus is calling us out. And he wants you to live up to what he created you to be. But here's the key. To live who you were created to be, you will have to face your shadow self. You will have to face your insecurities and your fears and stare them down and step forward in the life he called you to, even if it means living in a big, sometimes uncertain, dangerous world. Let me pray, but we're not done, okay? Because Jack's going to come out, and if the ushers want to come, we're going to take up the offering. Now, Jack's going to come out and close us in a minute. But let me say a prayer just to end our sermon time here. Father, we come before you, and we just, as much as we don't like it sometimes, as much as we would love growth to just be a simple gift that we just hold out our hands and get, we know that growth is so very valuable, that it takes us to that place of living the life you have called us to live. May we as a church and individuals live that life, God.